Good morning on the late breakfast show with Ben Vidgen on Fresh FM, the Deadline Report. We go out on a Sunday afternoons at 9 p.m. or you can listen to me at Sunday at 1 p.m. and Wednesday nights at 9 p.m. every second week. We're available podcasts on my website, Postman Productions, on the Fresh FM website, which you can also listen to live if you hit the link, or you can visit me on YouTube where I take all my radio shows and I'm speaking to you right now, as you can see, in the comfort of my home with just me, Yoda, and a good cup of coffee and a blueberry muffin to carry me along. Today we're carrying on my little series that we're going to be doing on the road to 9/11, or the road to, in fact, as much to March 15th. Last week I explained a little bit about the background of Islamic-based terrorists and the group that were affiliated with 9/11, which actually had a very strange neo-Nazi connections, while at the same time I illustrated the history of the American alliance with various neo-Nazi organizations, mostly, of course, the most famous being the NATO underground paramilitary force called Gladio that ran right-wing terrorist cells using former members of the neo-Nazi or former members of the Gestapo and the SS, as well as members of the Italian fascist organization. And they would use these people, as I explained, by wrapping them in an additional cover that they were actually affiliated to Masonic lodges, which wasn't necessarily, I don't believe, personally, the issue there is actually that the Masons were the issue. I think they were simply a good conduit organization. They fitted the need for privacy, for cell-like structure, so they exploited what was already there, as has been done in the past, to carry out their own goals and objective. My road to 9/11 is quite an interesting one, because in the year, it would be, I guess, we could go very briefly, go from 1980, when I first witnessed the South African rugby tour and the police standing up against protesters in my own street, in Elliott Street, the same year that I saw John Pilcher's documentary Year Zero, which was looking at the mass genocide executed by the Pol Pot, again another allied of the American intelligence apparatus, who carried out, literally executed millions and millions upon people. So again, this point is that you have a very good example of state terror. And then from the 1980s, we obviously the whole nuclear-free period, where we were worried about the possibility of a nuclear war, in which the governments would carry out the ultimate act of state terror by extermination of the entire planet. Accumulating for New Zealand our nuclear-free status, which has largely disappeared and been vanished as both Labour and National governments allowing more and more US troops and more military exercises, and we build things like Rocket Lab up in Mahia Peninsula, which is designed to carry hypersonic rockets. These are the backbone of the new nuclear arms race. So New Zealand is actually actively participating in the research for this new ultimate genocide, which unfortunately there doesn't seem to be a peace movement in New Zealand anymore. It's what's left over are largely apparatchiks of Labour, who make sure that they do what suits them politically, but actually aren't really interested in protesting against exposing the military-industrial complex's super activity within New Zealand. Of course, 1987 was the year that the Rainbow Warrior would be blown up in Auckland with the murder of one of the crew aboard it, carried out by agents of the French intelligence service, the DGSE. We knew that they were coming to New Zealand because of the previous meetings held at the Joint Intelligence Organisation in London. So we had advanced knowledge of these particular events. They still managed to go ahead. Our participation in things like Waihopai and the what we now call the Five Eyes intelligence service never paid us any dividend, as we know that the members of the boat, the French saboteur team that were on it, the boat, the Uvia, which escaped, were later picked up buy nuclear submarines. I don't know whether they were American or French, but they were picked up by a submarine. In exchange, the Americans never pursued it because they were given all the data for the nuclear explosions at Mura, carried out at Mura Atto, where our own late Prime Minister, Norman Kirk, had once sent a warship to protect protesters. This is, of course, versus currently where our governments are now changing laws so that you cannot protest at sea, inviting in the US B-52 bombers into things like warbirds at Wanaka, an aircraft that's specifically designed to drop nuclear bombs, is now invited into nuclear-free New Zealand, which obviously shows you that the spirit of nuclear-free and the nature of our Labour government is no longer anything likely remote to, unfortunately, to Norman Kirk, who, along with people like Whitlam and Allende in Chile, would oppose the CIA and the military-industrial complex and suggest that we didn't need to get tied up in superpower politics, but that we should actually form our own southern hemisphere alliance and actually go it alone and rely on our own natural resources and intelligence. All of those people, Kirk, Allende, Whitlam, would all be at some stage. The deaths would be controversial. In case, definitely in Allende, we can say that we know factually that he was overthrown by the American corporations, which again corporations that had actually worked with the neo-Nazis during World War II, supported by American intelligence, again had allowed neo-Nazis to come in and made use of their resources to fight supposed communism in South America and throughout Europe. We know that in Walt Whitlam's case, the overthrow of the Prime Minister by the Governor General's assisted overthrow of the government of the Prime Minister Walt Whitlam. We know that that was largely orchestrated by the American intelligence, and Jimmy Carter would effectively offer an apology, as John Pilcher writes in one of his books, decades after this event, and say, well, we'll never do it again, which is about almost an outright admission to the fact that they were being behind it. There is lots of stories about Norman Kirk, which was we won't go into today. People are very easy to dismiss, thinking, oh, that's all conspiracy theory. That may be the case, but what can be said is that Bob Harvey was the head president of the Labour Party, and his counterpart, who was Michael Wall, who wrote a very interesting book called Museum Street, both maintain that Kirk was its death was linked to the assassination by American intelligence in operating at the embassy in New Zealand at a time which, as I point out, the Americans were up to all sorts of bad skullduggery around the world. So really, it shouldn't really surprise any of us that this sort of thing actually goes on. So this was my road to 9/11, which we will pick up on with in terms, and we'll pick up the pace a wee bit about bringing you into my encounters as we get towards the September 11th, a couple of years out. You're on Fresh FM, and we are going to go for war. What's it good for? Because at the end of the day, every terrorist has got to have a sugar daddy, and more often than not, turns out to be the military-industrial complex out to make $1 out of killing. Murder Inc. You're listening to Ben Vidgen, the Deadline Report, Fresh FM, and I'll be back in just a moment. Oh, the muffin. Very nice. You're on Fresh FM, the Deadline Report with Ben Vidgen Investigates. We're looking at the road to 9/11 and turn how that links to the road to March 15th. We've been basically the shows have been looking first of all at the actual World War time connections or history of things like the CIA and Islamic terrorists, which overloads the fact that those connections actually have also very strong right-wing connections. So the idea that the Western intelligence services say, well, we had no idea that right-wing extremists out there, I don't know why, because not only has there been plenty of signs of it, and they have been over the decades extremely active and extremely violent, but they've also worked time and time again very, very closely with the Western intelligence services. Um, so, you should know because they're your buddies, is basically what I'm saying. On my road to 9/11, I've explained, how my political science degree, how I specialise in the study of terrorism, and I've explained some of my own childhood experiences about witnessing state terrorism, both in terms of state terrorism, nuclear terrorism, witnessing people reporting on things like the genocide of Cambodia. And today we are looking at this connection of all the signs about to 9/11 and what was really going on. In 1996, no, it would be later than that. It would be 1999. I had a chance or even maybe 2000. I had a chance to interview James Adams, who was no longer working for the Security Intelligence Service, but at the time when I was interviewing him, was the desk officer for the Security Intelligence Service Middle Eastern desk. And I sat down and I interviewed him in a cafe in Wellington, and I was quite shocked to find that not only did this person whose desk was Middle Eastern, affairs, but this man who had a degree in psychology didn't speak Farsi. He had no knowledge of Middle Eastern or any political groups at all, really. He had no military or police training, and this was the man that we were setting up to protect us from Islamic terrorists. So I thought that was quite odd to begin with. And at the same time, we were chatting, and he confirmed my own suspicion that yes, that the intelligence services did keep an eye on stock markets because yes, terrorists, especially their finances, are able to, because they know what's going to happen, they can actually make money from their terrorist attacks as well by simply knowing which stocks are going to go up and which are going to go down. And this was something I'd seen from my time in Australia when I worked for the Westpac, and had seen stocks for security X-ray machines go up literally the day before TW or Flight 0800 blew up during the Atlantic Olympics. So we will see this happen again during 9/11, which specifically was short trading, and we'll get into that a little bit. Let's not jump the gun too far. So I sort of was already aware of the fact that terrorism wasn't just about blowing things up. Terrorists had an economic component, which is what, going back to the neo-Nazis of the West, if they were going to wage the rise of the far right was ever going to come back, they weren't going to wage it as a military campaign, they were going to wage it as an economic campaign. And we saw, of course, the existence of these far-right groups that were funded by the American intelligences throughout the 70s and the 80s, not just in Europe with things like P2 or Gladio, the cells of P2, but also with the various different mercenary organisations fighting little brush wars and proxy wars for Western intelligence and oil companies and mining companies that also had these very far-right connections, such as General Singlab, who basically associated with Soldier of Fortune and would go on to help assist the Americans during the Iran-Contra, providing weapons to the far right in Nicaragua and other parts of America, and assisting, providing forces and weapons again to people like Osama bin Laden in Afghanistan. So you must remember that Osama bin Laden was an American creation. Around about 2000, I guess this is the pace starts to pick up. In 2000, I co-authored an article with Ian Wishart, who we've deviated and we look at the world in different views, but at the time he was my publisher, and he was publishing Investigate magazine, and I worked on an article called Pacific Jihad. And we were looking at the role of Islamic terrorism, and I think in about the third paragraph of that article, which is Investigate magazine, October 2000, we talk about the plan of Islamic terrorists to use civilian airplanes in terror attacks. This is in October 2000, almost a year to the date that 3 planes would be hijacked and flown into the buildings of the Twin Towers, the Pentagon, and that event was known as Operation Bojinko. And what had occurred was the same terrorists that had carried out the attack on the 12 Twin Towers in date eludes me, but the terrorist was Yusuf Ramzi. It might have been the 1990s actually he did it. And in this Operation Bojinko, they found a terrorist cell in the Philippines, and they found a laptop which had details of plans, very detailed plans, naming buildings within the United States, including the World Trade Center, that they planned to attack with this particular method that they would successfully do so a year later. That single event itself allows me to state clearly, without saying it's a conspiracy theory, because it is simply a matter of public record, which I published 12 months before the events of 9/11, shows me that when the official narrative says that they had no idea, just like they said they had no idea with the terrorist attack on March 15th in Christchurch, just like they told us that they had no idea that there was planning to be a terrorist attack in New Zealand in 1987 with the French Rainbow Warrior, which we now know because of events after the event that they did know because of the joint intelligence meeting held in London the year beforehand. That they were aware that these people were operating in the Pacific. So what it allows me to say is that when they say that they had no idea that this was going to happen, that's a lie. It's a lie, because we have Operation Bojinko showing you who, and the person itself, Yusuf Ramzi, who had previously already had a go at the Twin Towers, is a man that Benazir Bhutto, who's the late president of Pakistan before she was assassinated, turned around and said in an article which appeared in the Christchurch Press in 1995, saying the people that tried to assassinate me, and this was the first attempt when they failed, and the people that were responsible for the attack on the Twin Towers, which is, again, I mentioned this event in my article, State of Terror, Nexus Magazine, November-December 1995, had less to do with Islam and more to do with oil. So again, this whole aspect that the terrorists are actually motivated by a sugar daddy, and it's not just about blowing shit up, but it's about controlling markets as well. As I confirmed, was accepted as being part of the methodology which would take place, that the West Intelligence Service, like people like James Adams of the SAS, accepted that's what terrorists were doing, but only mainstream media can't quite bend their heads around the fact that terror isn't just about bombs and machine guns, it's also about bank accounts and economics. So at that point in October, and I'll be honest, when I wrote that particular event, which was actually relating to various terrorist people that were operating accounts in New Zealand, including Dr. Ayman al-Zawahiri, who that claim to fame would later be verified by a Hamid Nur, I think his name was, a Pakistani journalist, recognized expert, and Osama bin Laden would confirm that yes, Dr. Ayman al-Zawahiri had set up front companies for the purposes of laundering money, and that it included companies in New Zealand. And so had the Tamil Tigers and the Muslim Brotherhood, and these were all organizations that also could be found with accounts with the Bank of Commerce, Credit and International, BCCI. BCCI was a bank that, again, when I interviewed James Adams of the Security Intelligence Service, would turn around and say he had never heard of them. And again, you sit there scratching your head when an organisation like BCCI was on the front cover of Time magazine, the sleaziest bank in history. It had massive print runs around the world, and here was a person meant to be the specialist in the Middle Eastern desk, protecting us from those evil Islamic terrorists. And yet, at the end of the day, their knowledge gaps, the black holes, were astounding about how much they did not actually know. On the night of 9/11, and I think we'll leave it, this will be where we conclude this part of our little road to September 11th. On the night of 9/11, approximately 2:30 in the morning, I was sitting down at my typewriter writing my first chapter to what will be published in 2006, my second book, State Secrets 2, Return Fire. And at the time, as I watched the first plane fly into the building on the anniversary of the invasion of Allende's government overthrown in Chile, of the date that 3 airplanes had been blown up by Islamic organization, the Palestinian affiliated terrorist organizations during the 1970s, and that was the date of an attempt to fly a light aircraft into the White House. I found myself thinking, no, this can't be happening. And then when the second plane flew in, I knew instantaneously what was going on, what black magic was being unfolded, and what the fact that we were going to end up in war, and the number of people's lies and manipulation that was going to be driven by this event. But the event for me had actually taken place at that time. As I was writing about a little bank in Switzerland called Al-Taqwa, which would later be outed as the very bank being used to launder money for the 9/11 terrorists. But in this case, I was writing about their roles in their assistance of laundering money for the CIA. Same bank, the very same bank that would be, as I was literally in my fingers on the keyboard, would turn out to have actually US intelligence connections. And this is what blows me away. At the same time, I was writing about the American CIA connections to the mosque in Brooklyn, which again the 9/11 terrorists would be associated with, and how it had been used by the CIA to recruit terrorists to fight alongside neo-Nazis in places like Chechnya and Bosnia and the Balkans, in which every time that it was seen Dr. Ahmed al-Zazari, Osama bin Laden's 2IC, flying regularly coming into America, where his passport would be rubber stamped and the authorities would look the other way as he was doing operations for the CIA, as published in Maclean's magazine pre-9/11. Maclean's is a Canadian-based magazine, very mainstream. We would find the Le Figaro, the French paper, would also out up to 6 weeks that the terrorist organization, the Muslim Brotherhood, which had helped run the Muslim brigades in Bosnia, what Dr. Ahmed al-Zawahiri had overseen, using weapons funded by Islamic nations, but transported and provided by the Western intelligence services. And I would be writing about this connection to these very mosques that the 9/11 people were, as I watched the first planes fly into the building of the Twin Towers. And I'd only begun my book because of a conversation I had occurred on July the 23rd with my work colleague at that time, which was a man known as Norman Perret. If you're out there, Norm, g'day. Norm had a very interesting career. He'd served in the New Zealand Special Air Service and had actually hired me. It was in a totally different job. We were managing a restaurant because he knew that I'd written State Secrets and he was curious to find out what kind of person I was. And we became very good friends. But we would sit down and read the newspapers every day. And he would talk about what he'd seen on television the night beforehand, and we'd compare notes before our work day began. And Norm said to me on this particular occasion, July 23rd, he said, "Oh yeah, there's Osama bin Laden's going to carry out a terrorist attack." And I said to Norm at the time, I said, "Oh, where did you hear that?" He said, "Oh, CNN." And I went, "Oh, rubbish, Norm. They're all saying that Osama bin Laden's going to do this and he's going to do that. It's like it never bloody well eventuates." And Norman said to me, "Oh no, I've talked to my bros, meaning his mates who are still serving in the SAS, who we now know were actually already gearing up for deployment. In this case, they were deploying to Operation Brightside, which was a military exercise held in Egypt, or it might have actually been the other way around. It might have been the Swift Sword, which was the exercise that was held in Oman, but one of the two. Totally a combination of 140,000 troops were literally on the border of Iraq on September the 10th, the day before the event. What a coincidence! And he said, "No, I've talked to my brothers and taken it seriously." I said, "Oh, well, look, Norm, we'll have a look. Let's see if there's anything that sticks out." And I opened a newspaper on the Dominion Post, July 23rd, and there was a column, 1 inch column by 1 inch column, saying that the Syrians had pulled 30,000 of the troops, had pulled them actually out of Lebanon, which at that point was Syrian occupied. And I said to Norm, reading what I saw was an army getting the hell out. You could see something was coming. They didn't want to be caught and pasted. So their step was to withdraw and not get caught as the meat in the sandwich. And I said to Norm, I said, "Oh, wow." I said, "There's going to be a huge terrorist attack, and it's either going to happen in the Middle East against the US target, or it'll happen in the US. And whenever it happens in the US, it'll be so big, you will not be able to mistake the event that we're talking about." And that was on July 23rd, on the same day that there was an article called "Beware of Mass Islam on Western Borders," or I might be slightly paraphrasing, same paper, looking at how the Chinese and Russians were very aware of the paranoia the West had of Islam, and were quite happy to utilize it to push through their own agenda. And in this case, that was talking about the Islamic people, on the Uruguay people, that are of course being subject to state-based terrorism by the Chinese government, occupied governments. But in this case, it was marking the event of which led me to start to look at a series of what I could see very actively was there were terrorist cells in Ahmed Rashid shipping in a carload of explosives to Brooklyn. There was all this activity which made me start to realize that some big event was occurring. And this is what I was writing about. And it began my second book. And this is what I'd be writing about in my first chapter on the event that 9/11 actually occurred. And we'll talk about some of the events of 9/11 and what's happened in terms of critique of the official establishment since then, but we'll do that on next week's show. So you've been listening to the Deadline Report with Ben Vidgen. Have a good weekend.